Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Well, this is my second time recording this podcast. Why? Because I'm an idiot. Well, I made the entire podcast without turning on the mic. See, I'm an idiot. But anyway, I have nobody to apologize to. I can't apologize to myself. So I'll just go ahead and start all over again. I will try to include most of the points, if not all of the points that I discussed the first time around, and maybe even add some additional things. As you know, I do these things extemporaneously, so I have no script. Basically, the entire thing is just off of my head, and it seems like, at least today, my head is not working so well. Regardless, the topic for today is the selective medicalization of deviance. We will get to that eventually. I should say at the beginning that the term medicalization of deviance is a common theme in the sociological literature. My addition of the term selective is not, but you will see why I have added that as we get to the end or toward the end of this podcast. To give some examples of this, I wanted to start out by talking about some by early I mean 19th century, in some cases continuing into the 21st century, but 19th century forms of healing. Now, obviously, I'm going to be leaving a lot out. I'm not going to be talking about Bach flower remedies. I'm not going to be talking about osteopathy, and I'm not going to be talking about homeopathy. But I will be talking about some other things, which are all basically related to one another. So there is a logic to my madness. There are three basic things that we'll talk about. First, Phineas Quimby. Phineas Quimby is the guy who really is the head man in this. He started the whole ball rolling. Mary Baker Eddy. She was the founder of what is officially called the Church of Christ Scientist, but which is informally known as the Christian Science Church. And then finally, the New Thought movement. And there are a variety of different sects of New Thought. One of them is religious science, which is itself divided into two major sects. Then you have divine science, and then you have unity. So those are the three basic branches of 19th century, I guess you could call them alternative methods of healing that existed back in the 19th century. And then we'll progress from there. We'll start with Phineas Quimby. Phineas Quimby is the true originator of Christian Science. Yes, he was. I realize that is a controversial statement to make for a variety of reasons. One is that many people who have made that statement have been accused of being sexists. And I can understand why, because it's kind of minimizing the role of Mary Baker Eddy. But as an academic, when I'm looking at things from an academic perspective, I can't allow those kinds of things to influence me. I have to focus on the evidence. And all the evidence shows that the originator of Christian Science was not Mary Baker Eddy, but was Phineas Quimby. How did that happen? Well, it's a pretty simple story. Mary Baker Eddy became a patient of Phineas Quimby. Phineas Quimby is the guy who coined the term Christian Science. And his method of healing, which is basically a kind of mind or mental healing, was almost identical to the method of healing that was proposed by, you guessed it, Mary Baker Eddy. Okay. When you take the writings of Phineas Quimby and you put them alongside Science and Health with Keys to the Scriptures, which is the basic text of Christian Science written by Mary Baker Eddy, there are portions of it that literally are directly plagiarized from the writings of Phineas Quimby. And that is understandable. She was Quimby's patient. Now, if you go to a Christian Scientist, they will reject every single thing I have said. As a sociologist of religion, I can understand that. As an academic, I can't. But since I've dealt with so many different religions throughout my career, and I understand what triumphalism is, meaning the desire to place one's own religion as the superior religion above all others, which is what triumphalism is, I can understand it from that perspective. But as an academic, somebody who relies upon empirical evidence, I can't understand it. And so I have that conflict always going on inside of my head as a sociologist of religion. Needless to say, Mary Baker Eddy did plagiarize large portions of Quimby's work and put them into her Science and Health book. That's a fact. It may not be a convenient fact for Christian Scientists, but if any Christian Scientists happen to be listening to this podcast, which I honestly doubt, because hardly anybody listens to my podcast, but if you are, I would encourage you to get a hold of the writings of Phineas Quimby. You can find them on the web. You can just download them. They're out of copyright. They're free, and put them alongside of the writings of Mary Baker Eddy, and you will see exactly what I mean. Perhaps that may be one reason why the Church of Christ Scientist has been declining in numbers. It is nowhere near as big as it once was. I suspect there are other reasons too, but I think one of the reasons is the internet and the availability of all this stuff. I mean, if you go back to the pre-internet days, Phineas Quimby's work was not widely available. Now it is. You can download it. You can look at it, at what he wrote. And then you can look at what Mary Baker Eddy wrote. And you can see that they use the same words in the same order. In other words, Mary Baker Eddy plagiarized much of her text, Science and Health, from the writings of, you guessed it, Phineas Quimby. Now, why did she do that? I don't know. I can't get inside her head. I guess she wanted to get a name for herself. But Mary Baker Eddy is regarded within the Church of Christ Scientist as being a prophetess. So, if you are a faithful Christian Scientist, you cannot continue to be a faithful Christian Scientist once you recognize that Eddy plagiarized her work from Phineas Quimby. You can't. I mean, how can you? Plagiarism is property theft. Now, admittedly, in the 19th century, plagiarism was not taken as seriously as it is today. That is true. but it's still plagiarism. In other words, regardless of how it was seen back in the 19th century, the fact still is that Mary Baker Eddy got most of her ideas from the ideas of Phineas Quimby. I mean, why would she not? She was one of his patients. That's documented. Most Christian scientists will acknowledge that. So I don't understand why it is such a jump to acknowledge that she plagiarized her writings from the writings of Phineas Quimby. Well, I guess I do understand it, but it's hard to make sense out of, at least to me, because I try to be an honest person. So that's why I guess it's hard for me to understand. But regardless, Phineas Quimby coined the term Christian Science. Mary Baker Eddy got that term from Phineas Quimby. So basically, everything about Christian Science, with maybe one or two exceptions here and there, came directly from Phineas Quimby. Now, what is Christian Science? Well, Christian scientists say that one should, for the most part, rely upon Christian Science healers to heal you of all or almost all maladies. They make a couple of exceptions, like having your bones adjusted, whatever. But for the most part, they say you need to go to a Christian Science healer. Now, what is a Christian Science healer? It is somebody who will pray for you. But in Christian Science, to become a Christian Science healer, you actually have to be certified. You have to become a certified prayer. That's basically what you are. That's what a Christian Science healer is. A certified prayer, not a prayer, but a prayer. And so anybody, doesn't matter who you are, you don't have to be a Christian Scientist, can call up the Christian Science Church and ask to be prayed for by a Christian Science healer. It's free. Well, for that matter, you can ask your friend to pray for you. I don't see what the difference is, but I guess it makes a difference if you are a Christian Scientist. Okay, now, there are some people, or there were some people, who did not like the kinds of stringent regulations that were imposed by Mary Baker Eddy. Like, you can only have your bones set and a couple of other things by a physician. But other than that, you needed to see a Christian Science healer, a prayer. And so a new movement was born. That movement was called, and still is called, New Thought. There are some practitioners of New Thought who were directly inspired by Mary Baker Eddy, and there were others who were directly inspired by Phineas Quimby. So you have that kind of split. Now, does it really make any difference practically? No, because they were both teaching essentially the same ideas. But regardless, some came from Quimby and some came from Eddy, if that makes any difference to you. There are three major New Thought, let's call them groupings. One is religious science, which is divided into two major denominations. Used to be three, now it's two. Then you have Unity, which is headquartered in Unity Village, Missouri, which is right near where I used to live, and I visited the place. It's very attractive. And then third is Divine Science, which is very small. I'm not sure how many members they have, but it's pretty tiny. I think that divine science may even be on the verge of extinction, but whether that's an exaggeration, I don't know. But I do know that there are not that many divine scientists left. Still, those are the three major branches of New Thought. Now, what is the difference between New Thought and the Christian Science as it was founded by Mary Baker Eddy? This is it. People in New Thought, generally, there are always exceptions to everything, but generally have no objection to seeing a physician, because their view is that all healing comes from God. So whether it comes from a prayer, whether it comes from a physician, or whether it comes from a chiropractor or a homeopath, if one is foolish enough to see somebody like that. I'm sure that's just made me tons of enemies. It doesn't matter. You can go to anybody who will offer you help, legitimate healing help. They don't care. To them, all healing comes from God. So it's a much more tolerant, I guess you could say, or perhaps universal is even a better word, approach to healing than the one that was espoused by Mary Baker Eddy. I have studied a lot of the different New Thought denominations. They all pretty much believe in the same thing. The founder of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, which we'll get to, was actually influenced by New Thought through the works of Emmett Fox, who was a divine science minister. But that's neither here nor there. We'll get to talking about Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, in a bit. Okay, so that's basically the string of New Thought, Christian Science, and Ernest Holmes type healers that we'll talk about. We could talk about a lot more. I could have you here for hours. I'm sure you wouldn't stay for hours. You'd get up and you'd probably smash the computer screen and storm out of the room. Hopefully not, but you may want to after listening to me talk for that long. In any event, that was a summary of some of the forms of what is often regarded as mental healing in the 19th century. All of them, with the exception of Quimby, exist today because Quimby was just Quimby. There was no organization that Quimby started. So after Quimby died, that was the end of Quimby. Whereas Christian Science still lives, still exists, albeit without many members. It's really, really dying rapidly. I mean, I remember as a kid, when you walked down a street every 2 blocks, and I'm not exaggerating, you would see a Christian Science reading room. Place you go in there, and they would have a variety of Christian Science literature, science and health, but lots of other things too. I have not seen a Christian Science reading room literally in decades. Now, whether that is based on a policy change by the Church of Christ scientist in Boston, maybe, but I don't think so. I think the reason is that there simply are not that many Christian scientists left. There are not that many Christian Science churches left either. It is a dying religion. There are a lot of dying religions. Christian Science is not the only one, but it is certainly among them. New Thought, I'm not sure if you could say it's dying. I guess you could say it's pretty much static, pretty much status quo. It's basically on the same level as it's been for a long time. Maybe it's grown somewhat, but to my knowledge, it has not grown that much. It's pretty much in a steady state. Let's just say a steady state. That's, I think, an accurate way of describing New Thought. Now, okay, so we will end there by talking about 19th century methods of healing, which have continued into the 21st century. Now, let's get into the 21st century and the concept of the selective medicalization of deviance. Okay, for this, we are talking about not Christian Science and not New Thought, and not the ideas, the mesmerist ideas of Phineas Quimby. We are talking about modern medicine. In the US, that would include both osteopaths or osteopathic physicians, as they prefer to be called, and medical doctors. Because in Europe, osteopaths are not physicians. They're basically like chiropractors. They do manipulations. Most osteopaths in the US do not do manipulations. They pretty much function these days like MDs. Why they exist separately from MDs is a mystery to me, but that's a question for another day. I suppose I could research that, but I have not yet. So that's what we're talking about in the US. Doctors of osteopathy and medical doctors. That's orthodox medicine in the US today. Osteopathic physicians and medical doctors. So when we discuss the selective medicalization of deviance, we are talking about what is done by them. Not only by them, and also various others like physicians' assistants, nurse practitioners, respiratory therapists, cardiac perfusionists, and a whole string of other people who are involved in the process of medicine. But basically, medicine as it is ordinarily understood, meaning what your insurance will pay for. Well, in some cases, your insurance will pay for chiropractic, which to me is a damn shame. It should not. It should not pay for chiropractic. Sorry, I'm just kidding, but I don't think it should. I do not like chiropractic at all. I think it's hokum. It's hokum. My sister, I'll tell you why. This is a sidetrack, but so what? When my sister was a little girl, she got deaf in her left ear. And I feel bad for that because I was the indirect cause of that. I had the mumps. She caught the mumps from me. I had no permanent damage from the mumps. But my sister lost her hearing in her left ear from the mumps. She went to a chiropractor, a guy named Dr. Keck. I still remember his name. Dr. Keck is not a good guy in my book. He promised my parents, that he could cure my sister of her deafness in her left ear. He could not do that. So she stopped seeing Dr. Keck, as deaf in her left ear as she was when she first started seeing him. That's one of the reasons I dislike chiropractic. Also, chiropractic is dangerous. You know that if you've ever been to one, they do this kind of motion where they kind of, I'm not going to try it, where they kind of crack your neck. If you've ever had that done, don't do it again. And I'm not saying that based on myself. That has been studied. That's been studied in a peer-reviewed journal. Okay, a peer-reviewed journal. What they found is that many people who have had that procedure done by a chiropractor have strokes. It can cause strokes. And that is a very common technique used by chiropractors. So look, if you want to go to a chiropractor and waste your money, that's your business. But what I would suggest is make sure that that chiropractor does not crack your neck. If you ask the chiropractor, will you crack my neck? And the chiropractor gets annoyed, you have a pretty good idea that the chiropractor will do that. Walk out. That's my advice to you. But again, chiropractic, not really that supported by the evidence. Maybe it can cure minor back pain. Maybe it can cure minor headaches. Homeopathy can't cure anything. Bach flower remedies can't cure anything. So stay miles and miles away from them if you can. That's my advice to you. You can take my advice or leave it. We are just going to be talking about what is generally called orthodox medicine, which in the US includes both medical doctors and osteopathic physicians. Okay, now, first, let's talk about the medicalization of deviance. And then we'll get more precisely into what I have written down here. I want to make sure I get it exactly right. The selective medicalization of deviance. Yeah, that's what I called it down here. The selective medicalization of deviance. I'm amazed I could read that without my eyeglasses, but I could. Okay. The best example, and the one that is most commonly used to illustrate the medicalization of deviance, is Alcoholics Anonymous, commonly known as AA. I have known a lot of people who've been to AA. A lot of people. Have I? No, I'm not an alcoholic. As far as I know, I'm not addicted to anything except doing podcasts. But I like that addiction. So if that's an addiction, I want to keep it. But no, I'm not. As far as I know, I have no addictions. So I've never had any need for any kind of 12-step group. But to many 12-steppers, that doesn't matter. You should find a need for one. I've actually had people tell me that, including my sister, believe it or not. Well, maybe that's pretty obvious considering, well, anyway, I'll leave that alone. I'm not going to get into a long discussion on that. That would really be a sidetrack. In any event, if you look at the way Orthodox medicine works, it basically looks for medical explanations for everything, right? It's called it's called the medical model. There are different models of healing, but the medical model, which is one of the models, basically says that the way to be healed is to see a physician or one of the physician's auxiliaries, like a nurse practitioner or a medical assistant or somebody like that. You don't go to a voodoo practitioner. You don't go to a homeopath. You don't go to a chiropractor. You don't go to someone who administers Bach flower remedies or American flower remedies for that matter. You go to an Orthodox physician and that's it. Okay. So what has that meant? Well, in principle, the idea of the medical model is okay. to an extent. I mean, the medical model has given us a lot. No one can really deny that legitimately. I mean, if it were not for the medical model, we would not have a polio vaccine. If it were not for the medical model, we would not have a vaccine for COVID, and so on. All of those things are products of the medical model. So the medical model has done a great deal of good. The problem is where the medical model is universalized, meaning taken into areas where some would argue, including me, that it should not be taken. For example, and here we get to the subject I said we would get back to, alcoholism and Alcoholics Anonymous, commonly known as AA. Well, where did AA come from? Most people don't know that. If you ask the average person what is the source of AA, they would fumble. They wouldn't know. But I know because I've studied it as a sociologist of religion. It came from an organization called Moral Rearmament, sometimes nicknamed the Oxford Group, which was started by a guy named Frank Buchman. We'll just call it the Oxford Group here for convenience. Frank Buchman was an ordained Lutheran minister. And so really, I guess you could say that the Oxford Group was his own personal Lutheran ministry or something like that. And it was a way of helping people with any kind of problem. And if you read through the literature of the Oxford Group, you can tell that it is Lutheran if you know what Lutheranism is. You can recognize the Lutheranism in Buchman's writing. If you don't know what Lutheranism is, I guess not, but I know what Lutheranism teaches. And so when I read Buchman's work, I can say, that's Lutheran. All right, so Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, became a member of the Oxford Group. And he claimed that by attending the Oxford Group and practicing its steps, that he was cured, I should say recovered, and then cured of alcoholism. Now, you heard me use those words recovered and cured if you're paying attention. If you don't know anything about AA, you know that recovered and cured are foul language. Well, maybe not foul language, but you don't use them. If you use them in AA and you claim that you are recovered or cured, they call you a dry drunk. Okay? But Bill Wilson said he was recovered and cured, and he started AA. He wrote both the Big Book and its predecessor, which is called the Multilith, which is basically like the Big Book, except slightly different wording that was kind of edited into what is today referred to as the Big Book. Now, if, like me, you have read the appendices to the Big Book, you have seen something which may have confused you. And that is that in those appendices, it talks about people who were recovered and cured of alcoholism in one day. I'm not lying. You can check it for yourself. I'm not going to read it for you. You know, you can look the thing up. It's on the web, whatever. But people who were recovered and cured in one day. That's what Wilson believed. The idea that one is always in a process of recovering, which is what the modern AA teaches. and that one can never really be cured, is a thoroughly modern innovation. That was not what Bill Wilson taught. That was not a part of the original AA. Now, have there been people who have tried to go back to the original AA? Yes. One of those groups is called Recoveries Anonymous, and they literally have gone back to the original AA of Bill Wilson, where you can be recovered and cured in one day. And they also use a bunch of additional literature, including, I mentioned Emmett Fox, a New Thought writer, also a book by William James, Varieties of Religious Experience, various passages from the New Testament, whatever. All of those are part of their readings. Those things are not a part of the readings of the modern AA or of any of the 12-step groups that have broken away from them, like Debtors Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Sexaholics Anonymous. I don't know, a bunch of them. There's a whole bunch of them. There are literally hundreds of groups that are broken away from AA to deal with their own particular type of addiction. To my understanding, all of them have had to get legal permission to use parts of the 12 steps, even though they modified the wording a bit from AA. Generally, AA is pretty easygoing about giving that, but you have to get that permission from AA in order to use the wording. And most of them do use almost exactly the wording. For example, with the exception of alcoholism, Debtors Anonymous puts debtors. With the exception of alcoholism, Narcotics Anonymous puts drug addict, whatever. But they all basically use pretty much the same wording. And they all follow basically the same procedures. There really is not that much of a difference from one contemporary 12-step group to another. Now, modern 12-step groups have said that it is possible to go through a process of recovery, but not to be recovered. And it is never possible to be cured. That was an innovation introduced into AA after Bill Wilson was no longer in charge of the organization. Understandably, Bill Wilson was furious. He was furious. He accused them of betraying the movement, all these things. Now, was the original AA more successful than the new AA? That is a question which unfortunately cannot be answered. Why? Because when the original AA existed, it was not studied. There were no empirical studies done on the effectiveness of the original AA. There have been studies on the effectiveness of the modern AA. And if you've studied it, you know they have only a 10% success rate. They admit that. They admit it. They don't lie about it. What they say, however, is they use their motto, or one of their mottos. It works if you work it. So basically what they are doing is blaming the victim. They're saying the problem is not with AA. Oh, no. The problem is with the alcoholic. The alcoholic is not following the program faithfully. No. I mean, that's pure silliness. Only an idiot would believe something like that. I'm sorry for my bluntness, but This subject, more than many other subjects, makes me really, really angry. Why? Because I know too many people who have been deluded by AA, have not been helped by it, and have left in anger. These are friends of mine. And I like these people. I care for these people. So if I seem more aggressive than I ordinarily do, that's the reason why. Because to me, even though I have never been in AA or any other 12-step group myself, I have a tremendous amount of empathy for those who have. For those 90% who have not been successful at it. And guess what? That 10% success rate is identical to the success rate of people who do not go to AA. So whether you go to AA or you don't go to AA, you have a 90% chance of failing. That's pretty bad. That's that's disgusting to me. Really disgusting. Why an organization like AA that knows that, they know that, unless they're so indoctrinated into it that they can't see dark from light, they know that. So why don't they simply shut the organization down? Anybody with any level of integrity, I think, would do just that. Now, if there were no other programs that actually helped alcoholics, well, you might make not a very good argument, but at least some argument for AA. But the fact is, there are. The major one is called community reinforcement, which was developed by marriage and family counselors. It's kind of a tough love approach to alcoholism and drug addiction. Basically, a pact is made between the family and the addict. The agreement is that we have the keys, we meaning the people in the family. The addict does not have a key. If the addict comes home drunk or stoned, the addict is not allowed in. If the addict tries to break in, the police are called. That works. That works. So we do have a methodology which works. It's not like we're walking around without any guidance. We have guidance, but we're simply not taking advantage of it. And I think that there are a number of reasons for that. Perhaps the major one is the way in which the criminal justice system works. It is much easier for a judge, when dealing with somebody with a DUI, driving under the influence, or DWI, driving with intoxication, to send a person to a certain number of AA or DA, not DA, NA meetings, than to say, you need to practice community reinforcement. First of all, how is the judge going to do that? What if that person has no family? What do you do in that case? So community reinforcement requires a lot more work. And judges, either they don't want to do that work, or understandably, they think, I can't do that work. So they send people to Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous meetings, which basically do not work. That's the situation as it exists right now. So we are left with a situation where drunkenness has been medicalized as alcoholism, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. I mean, it's better to regard somebody as being ill than being sinful, which is how drunks used to be seen. But there are problems with that. First, the assumption by AA that alcoholism is a disease when it is not. It is not a disease. It is a type of substance abuse. It can cause diseases, kidney, liver. I'm not an expert. I'm not a medical doctor, but it can cause diseases. But alcoholism itself, drug addiction itself, are not diseases. People in Sexaholics Anonymous even have the gall to say that sex addiction is a disease. People in Gamblers Anonymous say that compulsive gambling is a disease. People in Debtors Anonymous, compulsive gambling is a disease. No. If they say that, the burden of proof is on them, not on me. If I reject that, I don't have to provide evidence against it. They're the ones who are required to provide evidence in favor of what they are saying. And in fact, the evidence simply does not exist. That's the system that we are left with. A system basically which does not work, where alcoholism, drug addiction are treated using methodologies which are entirely ineffective. Even these rehabilitation centers, which are all based on what is technically called the Minnesota model, because the first organization to practice it it still exists. Hazelden is located in Minneapolis. It is based on the 12 steps plus counseling. It also does not work that well. So we're doing things that are literally driving ourselves into a grave. We're digging our own graves without knowing that we're doing it. Most people simply assume if you're an alcoholic, you go to AA. If you're a drug addict, you go to NA, and so forth. Why? No reason. It's simply common knowledge, common practice, but there is no real basis, no empirical, no scientific basis, which is the only basis that matters to me as a social scientist. There is no empirical basis to support AA, just as there is no empirical evidence to support Christian Science or New Thought. So all of these things, people can do them if they want. They can practice them as long as they want to do them, but there is no empirical evidence which supports what they are doing. And so from my perspective, it is a damn shame. It is a damn shame that when they could be helped by something like community reinforcement, they are choosing, or maybe not choosing, maybe doing it out of ignorance, to throw their lives away, using treatments which have no empirical basis in reality. That's the problem. Now, let's make the transition to the selected or selective medicalization of deviance. This is a little bit of a twist. Not exactly the same as what we have been talking about up until now. When we look at who gets medicalized for drug addiction, say? Any guesses out there? White people. Among white people, people who are wealthy or upper middle class. Black and brown people don't generally get medicalized for drug addiction. When you look at our prisons in the United States, our prisons are chock full of black and brown people who have been convicted of drug abuse. When there have been studies done on addiction, whether it's drug addiction or alcohol addiction, there is no difference in the rates of addiction between white people on the one hand and black and brown people on the other. The problem is when police do busts, they generally do busts in minority neighborhoods, not in white neighborhoods. If they did those busts in white neighborhoods too, you would find as many white people, I think, in prison for drug possession or drug dealing as you find black and brown people. But that's not the way the American system works. So that is an example of something that we call in sociology institutionalized racism in policing. So we can fuse two things together: institutionalized racism in policing and the medicalization of deviance. Because in that case, they work together. And they both work to produce negative outcomes for the poor, for the disadvantaged, for the subaltern, They are the ones who are hurt the most by the existing system, not only the medicalization of deviance, but the system of policing as it exists in the United States, which targets black and brown communities and essentially leaves white communities alone. If there was ever a tragedy that needed to be addressed, I can't think of a greater one than that. Is it being addressed? Not really. Not sufficiently. Here and there, yeah, but not sufficiently. The problem is still with us. And there is no excuse for it. I mean, years ago, not that many years ago, but years ago, they found a disparity between black and brown people based on crack cocaine versus regular cocaine. What they found is that, well, crack cocaine is cheaper than regular cocaine, but they're both cocaine. Because crack cocaine is cheaper, the poor, which is disproportionately black and brown, can afford it. White people are more likely to be able to afford regular cocaine. And so you had a disproportionate number of black and brown people going to prison for cocaine. Crack cocaine nonetheless, but still cocaine, than white people. When that problem was discovered, it was addressed legally. What that shows is that we are not helpless. If we want to address a problem, we can. We have that choice. But in most cases, when it comes to the subaltern, living in American society, the marginalized people of American society, using a third world Maoist perspective, most people don't seem to care. And so the problem is simply perpetuated from one generation to the next. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.